This is the KNBC News Service with Paul Moyer and Ross Porter and Kelly Lang. Now, Paul Moyer.
Good evening, everybody. As we've been saying all week on this program, Tom Brokaw is on special assignment tonight. He'll be back Monday night at 11 o'clock. President Nixon went on nationwide television tonight to announce new ground rules that will lead to what they call Phase 4 economic game plan for the United States. Here is part of what the president said.
Effective immediately, therefore, I am ordering a freeze on prices. This freeze will hold prices at levels no higher than those charged during the first 8 days of June. It will cover all prices paid by consumers. The only prices not covered will be those of unprocessed agricultural processed products at the farm levels and rents. Wages, interest, and dividend will remain under their present control systems during the freeze. Now, the reason I've decided not to freeze wages is that the wage settlements reached under the rules of Phase 3 have not been a significant cause of the increase in prices. And as long as wage settlements continue to be responsible and non-inflationary, a wage freeze will not be imposed. The freeze will last for a maximum of 60 days. This time will be used to develop and put into place a new and more effective system of controls which will follow the freeze.
Mr. Nixon also told the nation tonight he plans to go to Congress and ask Congress for new powers to regulate the import and the export of food. Congressional reaction, as you might expect, was split along party lines to the president's announcements tonight. Some positive action at the Paris peace table today. Henry Kissinger, Lee Dak-to, and representatives of Saigon and the Viet Cong signed another set of agreements today aimed at strengthening the ceasefire in Indochina. The document was signed in the same hall in Paris that has housed 5 years of negotiations on peace in Indochina. Principal points involving the United States include resumption of talks about economic aid to North Vietnam and resumption of U.S. minesweeping activities around North Vietnamese seaports. The new agreement does not oblige the United States to stop its bombing over Cambodia. After the signing ceremonies today, peace negotiator Kissinger told a news conference, and he talked about the new accords.
And the history of Indochina is replete with agreements and joint declarations. And I'm not naive enough to pretend to you that the mere fact of having again agreed to certain words in itself guarantees peace. But it is never words alone that produce peace. It is the combination of words, intentions, and the consequences of non-performance.
Good morning. Several well-known economists listened to President Nixon say he's freezing prices and not wages for the next 60 days and then have some other controls after that. And you cannot say these economists who are talking about it are wild about it. Some say it's an improvement. That's Dr. Lawrence Klein at the University of Pennsylvania. Others think it is too little and too late, and economist Elliot Janeway adds too complicated and too political. There was a short strike today. Clerks and booking agents for national airlines went out at midnight. Negotiations went on, and a settlement came about 6 hours later. Sharif Sirhan, the brother of the man who killed Robert Kennedy, was convicted yesterday of writing a letter to Secretary of State William Rogers, saying that Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, would be shot and killed. The letter was signed Palestine Liberation Organization. The FBI found Sharif Sirhan's fingerprints on it, and he'll be sentenced next month. 40 or so people are stuck in 2 cable cars near Albuquerque, having spent the night there. Some wind lifted the cars from the drive cable, but they're all right on the guide cable. Police say they're safe, and a helicopter is coming later for them. This is Thursday the 14th, and the truce that everybody says they really mean this time is supposed to start in Vietnam at midnight tonight, Washington time. Saigon saying success depends on the goodwill of the communists. This is the birthday of sandpaper, the day Isaac Fisher patented it in 1834. Now, we know the Egyptians used powdered abrasives on their jewelry in the olden times, but nobody thought of gluing it to paper until Mr. Fisher did at his home in Springfield, Vermont, 139 years ago. And this is a good day to fly your flag because it's Flag Day. On June 14th, 1777, the Continental Congress said the country's flag should have 13 stripes of alternate red and white with a union of 13 stars of white and a field of blue. But that's about all they said, so there were several ways it was done, most often this way, but some people put the stars in a circle in the upper left corner, and other people switched places for the stars and the bars. So it took a while for it to become standard. There was a resolution later on that saying that the red meant hardiness and courage, the white meant purity and innocence, and the blue meant vigilance, perseverance, and justice.
This is the CBS Morning News with John Hart in New York and Barry Seraphin in Washington.
Good morning. Administration officials have made it plain the Phase 3 economic program was a failure. With prices shooting up, the president needed some breathing time to come up with the Phase 4 anti-inflation program. And so Mr. Nixon's announcement last night of a 2-month price freeze.
Whatever the reasons, every American family is confronted with a real and pressing problem of higher prices. And I have decided that the time has come to take strong and effective action to deal with that problem. Effective immediately, therefore, I am ordering a freeze on prices. This freeze will hold prices at levels no higher than those charged during the first 8 days of June. It will cover all prices paid by consumers. The only prices not covered will be those of unprocessed agricultural processed products at the farm levels and rents. Wages, interest, and dividend will remain under their present control systems during the freeze.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Roger Mudd, substituting for Walter Cronkite.
President Nixon's new strategy for fighting inflation today was being called Phase 3.5. In a nationwide speech last night, the president ordered a 60-day freeze on retail prices as a prelude to what will eventually be Phase 4. The freeze covers food prices but keeps wages, interest, and dividends under Phase 3 voluntary restraints. The freeze does not cover rents or unprocessed agricultural products at the farm level. In Washington, congressional reaction among both Democrats and Republicans was generally favorable with the overtones of wait and see. However, two leading economists, Paul Samuelson and Elliot Janeway, were sharply critical.
First, we had, in the beginning of the Nixon term, benign neglect of all incomes policy. Then we had the desperate throwing away the old game plan. In August 1971, we had Phase 1, Phase 2. Then, when we still needed the Phase 2 protection, it was thrown away. Now, we're desperately improvising with another freeze. Each one of these freezes is less effective than the previous one. You use up these particular tools, and so some of what we might have hoped to get from controls has been frittered away by indecision. This is schizoid economics.
We could control the entire international situation and stabilize the dollar if we mobilized our agri-power to do it. If we said, do you want our corn? Do you want our soybeans? Do you want our wheat? Come and get it, Japan. Come and get it, Germany. Come and get it, Russia. Come and get it, China. And put up the hard cash needed to restabilize the dollar as the condition of our giving it to you.
On the New York Stock Exchange, response to the president's speech was not enthusiastic. The Dow Jones Industrials today dropped 12.5 points. Volume was 13,200,000 shares. The average price lost 42 cents on the New York Exchange and 5 cents on the American. In his speech last night, Mr. Nixon also asked Congress for the authority to impose controls on the export of agricultural products such as grain and animal feedstuffs. It's just such products that are now in greatest demand abroad, and their sale weighs heavily in this country's balance of payments. For a look at European reaction, we have reports from Charles Collingwood in London, Peter Kalischer in Paris, John Chayan in Frankfurt.
Perhaps the most sensitive indicator of foreign reaction to President Nixon's new economic measures is the behavior of those who back their opinions with their own money, the buyers and sellers of American dollars. London's National Westminster Bank is one of those which did a lot of business in dollars today. What would you say is the verdict of European money managers on the president's new proposals?
I think that they consider, in the circumstances, they were insufficient, and more drastic measures will be necessary to redress the weakness of the dollar on the exchange markets.
At the French gold market and foreign currency exchange in the Bourse, the price of gold rose moderately. And when the foreign exchange market opened, the trading in dollars became brisk to feverish, and the dollar fell. It fell less than 1% from yesterday's close, but it did go down.
I don't tell that this measure will weaken the dollar, no. But I should be surprised if this announcement would strengthen the dollar. Because to strengthen the dollar, we need a more complete policy and an affirmation of the will to struggle against inflation.
The dollar had recovered a bit over the last couple of days in anticipation of President Nixon's new economic measures. But once he made his speech, the recovery stopped. In fact, the dollar fell. The German money men are disappointed.
And the people abroad are not getting any more confidence in the dollar?
No, you see, and you can't get confidence by talks. You must see facts.
You see, we all hoped that something very positive for the dollar would come out, and therefore the markets have been disappointed today, and therefore the reaction was that the dollar is much lower than it has been yesterday.
Japan is the biggest market for American agricultural exports, and for the Japanese, the president's economic message was not good news. Bruce Dunning reports from Tokyo.
Tokyo's stock market was posting moderate gains until President Nixon's speech was heard in Japan. Then many gains suddenly switched to losses with the news that Mr. Nixon proposes restricting agricultural exports so that foreign sales will not price meat and eggs off the American table. Japan is heavily dependent on the U.S. for many basic foods. On Tokyo's commodity exchanges, prices for U.S. agricultural imports soared drastically in somber trading. Japan is the world's biggest spender in the U.S. agricultural market. In 1972, Japan bought nearly $1.5 billion worth of American groceries. 90% of the soybeans for Japan's soy sauce come from the United States. Soybeans are among the items Mr. Nixon would restrict, a move that could create a crisis in Japan. To officials here, the proposed controls on agricultural exports seem like another example of Washington's failure to understand Japan's problems. Bruce Dunning, CBS News, Tokyo.
In Washington, Dan Rather was on hand as the president made his economic speech last night, and he has studied its text. Here is his analysis.
The first thing to recognize about the president's announcement is it does not solve the economy's long-range problems. It may check inflation and help the dollar temporarily, but labor, business, and Mr. Nixon's own staff agree. The freeze is strictly a stopgap, a kind of economic acupuncture as the president stalls for time. The second thing to recognize is delaying real decisions longer represents a high-risk operation. Phase 3 has failed, and the president admits that he does not yet know what to do about that. He stayed too long with the advice of Treasury Secretary George Shultz. John Connally, Melvin Laird, and Republican congressmen finally convinced Mr. Nixon of that, but to this day, the president still relies mostly on the same band of economic advisors who have been wrong so often. Even with these latest reluctant changes, Mr. Nixon may have done too little, too late. A strong argument can be made, for example, that the freeze perhaps should have been for longer, at least 90 days. Among questions critics ask are, if the Watergate scandals had not broken open, would the president, even this late, have changed his everything's all right economic stance? Why didn't he act months ago? How is it better for the housewife if the price of lettuce is frozen at 69 cents a pound when it could have been frozen at 49 cents a pound? The president has frozen food prices at their highest levels ever. Why didn't he order a rollback at least on food and gasoline. Why does he insist upon letting bankers and landlords make big profits? Well, that in outline form is what the president has done and what may be wrong with it. One thing comes clear. Neither the White House nor the Democratic leadership, whose big spending created much of the present inflation, seems to have fresh, workable ideas for stabilizing the economy. And unless somebody comes up with some soon, the risk is high that the country could be headed for a period such as 1970, when for working people there is a recession on top of inflation.
The manufacturers of 10 pain relievers today told the government they are not guilty of false and misleading advertising for saying their products are better than plain aspirin. The companies were responding to a March complaint by the FTC, which proposed that the manufacturers devote 25% of all future advertising to confessing their so-called mistakes. Some companies called the FTC proposal unconstitutional, and one company said that through its chilling effect, it would indirectly censor truthful advertising.
Day one of what people are calling Phase 3.5 began with an announcement by the Cost of Living Council that it plans a profit and price sweep to check price hikes that exceed a 1.5% limit. The council said it has already found at least 7 and possibly 9 industries that have broken that limit, and that it plans to order them to roll back prices. Congressional reaction was generally along party lines, with Republicans approving of the new game plan, Democrats saying it's too little too late. Retail food prices will be frozen for the next 2 months, creating a dilemma for processors that could result in a shortage of meat and other food products. ABC's Ron Miller reports.
The president's action assures the consumer that beef and other foods won't cost any more for the next 60 days. While farmers and ranchers are not included in the new restrictions, the economic pinch is centering on the middleman involved in processing food. Because the principle of supply and demand has not been regulated, what means trouble for the middleman may also mean difficult days ahead for the consumer. Most beef processors say they are working on a profit margin of 1/8 to 1/4 cent a pound. They have been under wholesale price restrictions since March. But if their prices have been frozen, their costs have not. Many would have liked the president to freeze wages. With his costs open to increases, but his prices controlled, the beef processor is in every sense the middleman. The result could be artificial meat shortages.
If the packers can't put up cattle to sell at their ceilings, there'll be a shortage of beef, and consequently there'll be a shortage at the wholesale level and a shortage at the retail level. This could be a boycott in reverse.
A shortage of beef created by wholesale and retail price restrictions could be followed by government rationing of beef or a thriving black market. But for now, most beef processors are only hoping for economic survival for the next 60 days and relief under Phase 4. Ron Miller, ABC News, Chicago.
Phase 3 began in January, ended last night. It was supposed to keep retail price increases at an acceptable level, but it didn't. ABC's Gregory Jackson went shopping today and has a retrospective of price rises during Phase 3.
If you want to talk about prices and you're looking for the true marketplace in America today, there's really only one place to go, and that's the suburban shopping centers, such as the one here in Peekskill, New York, about an hour or so out of New York City, and an institution similar to thousands across the country.
It's on this kind of battleground that the price war is being fought. Imagine that you're a housewife who had planned a shopping spree in January, but didn't get around to it until June, the day after prices were frozen. This is what's happened in the past 6 months. Here at the paint store, prices have remained the same on paint, but unfinished furniture, anything with wood for that matter, has climbed. A curio cabinet gone from $74 to $78.95 in 6 months, a 6.5% increase. Or maybe it's shoes you're after. Anything made of leather has moved up fast. These boots, for example. The small boot went from $18.99 to $21.99. The large boot from $22.99 to $26.99, a 17.5% increase in less than 6 months. In a woman's shop, we found them in between style changes, but basics such as lingerie were up 10% in 6 months. A $5 bra was up 50 cents, and the same for other foundation garments. Anything with wool was moving up fast until today, at least. In this store, wool carpets that were selling for $18.99 in January were up $2, an increase of 10.5%. At the liquor stores, some select imported wines have gone up as much as 40% in 6 months. And so it went, a baffling number of prices adding up to a bill we already knew. And even the merchants we talked to today were as relieved as their customers. All insisted they went up only as their wholesale costs spiraled. But today it stopped, at least for 59 more days. Gregory Jackson, ABC News, Peekskill, New York.
Opposing sides in the Vietnam conflict took steps today to implement the new truce communique signed yesterday in Paris. The Viet Cong Military Command issued orders to all its forces to effect a strict ceasefire by midnight tonight Eastern Daylight Time. The Pentagon announced that American minesweepers have been alerted to resume clearing operations in North Vietnam's coastal waters. In Saigon, South Vietnam's foreign minister called the new agreements advantageous, and in Paris, Hanoi negotiator Le Duc Tho termed it a great victory. But in Cambodia, which is not affected by the new agreement, fighting continued. U.S. warplanes staged their 100th straight day of raids. Here in Washington, the Senate today expressed more concern with the ongoing U.S. role in Cambodia than satisfaction with progress in Vietnam. In its strongest anti-war action to date, the Senate voted 67-15 to cut off all funds for the bombing of Cambodia or any other U.S. military involvement in all Indochina. Earlier today, Henry Kissinger was on Capitol Hill to brief lawmakers on the new Vietnam communique, but it was clear that Cambodia was uppermost in their thoughts. ABC Capitol Hill correspondent Bob Clark reports.
In separate briefings for House and Senate members, Kissinger apparently hoped to head off the congressional drive to force an end to American bombing in Cambodia. He appealed to both houses not to take final action cutting off bombing funds. The Senate's Republican leader, Hugh Scott, was among those who listened to the Kissinger plea. Later, Scott, who's been a stout supporter of the president's end-the-war policies, issued a statement saying he won't support the bombing after the end of this month. "We've had it," Scott said. Kissinger's plea brought a similar reaction from other senators.
Dr. Kissinger's argument was very persuasive, but I was not persuaded that the way to do that was by desisting from support of the amendment which would seek to end the bombing in Cambodia. I have the feeling, and I still do, that that the use of bombardment is not a technique by which the interests of peace are the most advanced in that area.
Dr. Kissinger's a very articulate gentleman, and he works very hard, but I'm persuaded more than ever after listening to him today that we have to go ahead and cut off the bombing in Cambodia because the administration will continue to bomb there indefinitely.
At a later press briefing, Kissinger was optimistic the new ceasefire agreement would settle the bombing issue by bringing an end to the fighting in Cambodia.
It is our best judgment that the possibilities for peace in Indochina have been strengthened. It is our objective to bring about the military disengagement of the United States as rapidly as we can, an objective we have consistently pursued, which we will continue to pursue.
Time for negotiating an end to the American role in Cambodia is clearly running out on the president and Dr. Kissinger. It appears more likely than ever tonight that Congress will soon cut off all funds for the bombing, whether or not the war in Cambodia goes on. Bob Clark, ABC News, Washington.
Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, in a rare Moscow news conference with American reporters, today said he has no intention of bringing pressure to bear on President Nixon because of the Watergate scandal. Brezhnev also denied that the Watergate affair might influence his talks with the president. Brezhnev arrives in Washington on Saturday for an 11-day state visit.
This has been the ABC.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Roger Mudd, substituting for Walter Cronkite.
Party boss Brezhnev arrives in this country tomorrow for next week's summit meetings with President Nixon. In Moscow yesterday, Brezhnev talked with American newsmen. Murray Thompson reports.
The unprecedented meeting with American correspondents lasted 3.5 hours. It was a neat piece of public relations. For a few hours at least, a Kremlin leader had come out of the shadows. He was cordial, expansive, and talkative, but he was careful to say little that was new. Brezhnev was optimistic the talks with President Nixon would be productive.
I cannot right now discuss all the possible agreements that might be concluded or signed during the forthcoming meeting, but I can say that I feel that the general tonality that has set in after our first meeting in Moscow inspires the confidence and the belief that the general trend in our discussions will be directed towards the further improvement of relations between our two countries in all spheres, and that the discussions will pass in a spirit of goodwill.
Asked if Watergate had damaged President Nixon's bargaining position, Brezhnev declared,
"What right have I to intrude or interfere in the so-called Watergate affair? I do not intend to refer to that matter. As I say, it is a purely domestic one, and in fact I would regard it as completely indecent for me to refer to it in this conversation with you, nor do I have any intention of referring to it while in the United States."
He denied that there are any laws preventing the immigration of Soviet Jews.
We do not have in the Soviet Union any law forbidding a Soviet citizen from leaving the Soviet Union and going to another country if that departure is justified. I'm sure that any nation has a law whereby it is forbidden for certain categories of people connected with what is today called national security from leaving from leaving their country.
Brezhnev wants American cash, credits, technology, and even long-term guarantees that he can buy our grain when he needs it. But he seems unwilling to make military and political concessions that would satisfy his American critics. Only when the talks get underway with the president will it be clear whether Brezhnev is truly willing to give as much as he wants to get. Murray Fromson, CBS News, Moscow.
In Washington today, 2 boys and 2 girls identified as members of the Militant Jewish Defense League staged a protest in the White House and were arrested. A spokesman said the 4 broke away from a regular White House tour, sat down on the floor of the Blue Room, and shouted for President Nixon to pressure Brezhnev into letting Soviet Jews emigrate. Brezhnev, of course, is not in the United States, and President Nixon was on his way to Illinois.
The American system is working. And Everett Dirksen would tell us today that the cynics of the day, not to shun the system, but to share in it, to enter the political arena, and to fight for their ideals.
The president then made an effort to smooth strained relations between the White House and Capitol Hill.
Now more than ever, we need to foster between the executive and the Congress a spirit of responsible partnership. Responsible partnership means recognizing that neither partner can have his way all the time. It means developing a spirit of give and take, with both sides doing some giving and both sides doing some taking.
Altogether, today's visit seemed to be an attempt to offset the widely held image of an administration paralyzed by Watergate, of a president under siege by Watergate. Bernard Kalb, CBS News, Pekin.
Action 4 with David Horowitz, weeknights at 5.
This is NBC Nightly News, Monday, June 18th, reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. 2 important stories tonight. The summit talks with the Russians began at the White House, and because of the summit, the Senate Watergate Committee has postponed its public hearings for 1 week. We'll have details on both of those stories. We'll see the giant rescue effort mounted today in the Florida Keys to save 4 men trapped in a small submarine. And we'll have another special report on the gasoline shortage. The second Soviet-American summit meeting in a little over a year got underway in Washington today at the White House, where President Nixon welcomed Soviet Party Chief Leonid Brezhnev. Here's a report on that ceremony from our White House correspondent, Richard Valeriani.
A slight drizzle stopped shortly before Brezhnev reached the White House, but his arrival from Camp David by helicopter was delayed because of the rainy weather. The President and Mrs. Nixon were waiting on the South Lawn as a presidential limousine brought Brezhnev from the helipad, heralded by Army trumpeters. The 2 men shook hands heartily, like 2 old friends who haven't seen each other for a while. Cannons boomed a 21-gun salute, a tribute to Brezhnev's status as the principal leader of the Soviet Union even though he is not officially the head of the government. The two men then trooped the line. At one point, Brezhnev plunged into the crowd, acting like an American politician out campaigning. And in a way, he was campaigning to make the Soviet Union and its policies more acceptable to the United States and to its people, especially its elected representatives in Congress. In his welcoming remarks, the president looked back to the Moscow summit, and he looked ahead to some progress on limiting offensive nuclear weapons at this summit.
This year, at the summit in Washington, we will not only build on the foundation that we laid last year, but that we have the opportunity to make even greater progress than we made last year toward the goals that we share in common. And above all, the goal that goes beyond our two countries, but to the whole world. The goal of lifting the burden of armaments from the world and building a structure of peace.
Но в политике действуют свои понятия относительности.
Brezhnev's reply used language strikingly similar to Mr. Nixon's. He said the Moscow summit last year had laid a good, reliable foundation for relations of peace between the two countries. And he said he and his delegation were prepared to work hard to ensure that the summit talks here serve the interests of a peaceful future for all mankind.
With those good words, we can move forward. Yes, sir.
The two leaders then moved forward to almost 4 hours of private talks, continuing right through a scheduled lunch break. The spokesman said afterward they reviewed the world situation in general terms on a philosophical plane without getting into specifics. The Russians said it was a good business-like beginning. Mr. Nixon was quoted as saying the talks were very good, very relaxed. One tangible result was approval of 3 and perhaps 4 new American-Soviet agreements to be signed tomorrow. Richard Valeriani, NBC News, Washington.